Environmentalism drives certain behaviors, and Christianity drives behaviors as well. In what ways do they overlap, and in which ways are they different? Welcome to The Conquering Truth. I'm Dan Horn.
I'm Jonathan Sides.
I'm Charles Churchill.
And I'm Joshua Horn.
When we think of what God says about the earth and how Christians are to treat the earth, it's very easy to see some overlap with environmentalism, because everybody should want to be good stewards of what God has given us to protect and to take dominion of. So what are the differences in worldview that drive differences in behavior between Christianity and environmentalism?
And I think that the goal here is to, get at some point in here to some practical things, but it is important to start with the worldview, because, differences in what you should do in your day-to-day life should be driven by your view of the world. And secular environmentalism has quite a bit different view of the world and of the earth and of nature than the Bible teaches. And if we don't understand that, then how do we understand how much of their practices should we follow?
And I think both of them start with the same idea. Both of them start with that the earth used to be good. God said that he saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day, right? In Genesis 1, he's starting out by saying that the world was good. And I think a lot of environmentalists would say the world was good until man came along and ruined it.
Well, a specific period in man's history, probably some form of the Industrial Revolution, give or take a little bit, but that's when things started to get bad.
Right, and that's where you kind of get to an issue is when is that time that we're going for? Nature is good, but they don't really have a reason as to why some particular nature is good and some is not. I mean, there are surface level reasons, but fundamentally, where is the moral principle that says this is the state of nature that we ought to be trying to replicate when we're restoring the world to its untouched state? Because nature's always changing. Different species are coming and going extinct, coming into like migrating to an island and these type of things. But it doesn't have a standard to say this is the point in time when things were good. But as Christians, we do. Now, we don't know a lot about it, but at least we know that there is a standard where God made the world and the world was good.
And one of the fundamental points from the Christian point of view is that there was no death. And that is very different than anything that the environmental movement can really point to. The environmental movement has to make its peace with death. In the end, there is a fundamental difference even with that sort of perfect state of the world and what that vision was, because in the end, they can't overcome death, but Jesus Christ, God, can.
And I think that you look at environmentalism, and I understand what you're saying about with the Industrial Revolution, but I bet if they reverted it so it was like at the Industrial Revolution, then they'd say there was some other time that it reverts to. And it's a never-ending problem, because how do you measure it? And as long as there's death, you're always going to say there's still problems, which is the fundamental issue, is that there's no attempt to even solve the problem of death, because what you're saying is goodness came out of death in the sense that evolution is driven by death, right? Survival of the fittest. This is how you got the planet the way that it is. So while they recognize they want to get rid of death, at the same time, they see death as the driver for good.
Right. Yeah. It's a very, practical problem as well. You go back in history to a time, say like when there were just, a few Indians in North America. Well, when there were just a few Indians in North America, what the Indians would do is, to help their hunting, they would burn vast tracts of woods, burn out the undergrowth. So there's probably plenty of places on the eastern seaboard where you go today and it's more wildernessy than it was in the 1600s, because there's no longer people just burning vast areas of the woods. And so was this the time when it's primitive man, the noble savage? Well, actually, arguably that, they were killing a lot of animals. Was that the ideal time? The Bible gives us a lot different view of nature than just as something that's good that needs to be preserved. But there's a real purpose under the Christian worldview for nature, and it's the purpose of all of the world to glorify God. And God designed the world so that nature points to him. That's something that you see scriptures talk about quite a lot, down to a lot of individual things. Probably one of the most concentrated parts of that is the last few chapters of Job, where God's speaking to Job and he's going animal by animal, saying, look at this animal, and this shows you how small man is and how great God is. And, so if you, under Christianity, those animals are put there. One of their purposes is to point to God, the trees, all these complexity of God's creation. And so if somehow it were possible for us to live in a world where we just asphalted over everything, well, that would be a huge, huge mistake.
And I think with that, what you see is, in Job, when you were saying that, what it struck me is that environmentalism also is the idea that man can understand these things and can have some concept. And when God's speaking to Job, what he's doing is going, were you there when I did this? Were you there when I fed this animal? Did you cause this calf to give birth? Did you do this? And to demonstrate just the complexity of the environment. And one of the things about environmentalism that's required is to simplify it so that man can control it. You have to make it really simple, really stupid, not nearly the complexity of how do you know how to have this animal have the right number of offspring so that they don't overpopulate and they don't underpopulate. And God goes, I designed the whole world to do this. And how do you know any of this? Why do you think you can do this? And environmentalism is directly opposed to that idea. It's I can understand. I do know what's best.
I mean, and in fairness, Christianity works the same way. It's just got a different substrate it's working on. And I'll explain that. You're saying that environmentalism has identified problems in the world. It makes really simple causal stories about problems in the world and then proposes simple, straightforward solutions. Now, they might require lots of effort, but conceptually they're simple. Well, Christianity is the same. It's talking about different things.
Well, the fundamental difference, right, is God came up with it versus us.
Right. The really simple problem in the world is man has sinned, and that's caused a separation between mankind and God. That's the fundamental problem that needs to be solved, which is a very different fundamental problem than what environmentalism proposes. And there's a really simple solution. The simple solution is repent, believe on Jesus Christ, be washed in his blood, and obey God. It's really simple things in a sense that are understandable. This is the way the world works, but it's looking at different parts of the world. One of them is really focused on the work of God, and the other one is focused on what man can do in nature.
And I do think a fundamental difference, too, is environmentalism's looking at it and saying, we figured it out. And Christianity is, we've been told. And that is a fundamental difference. The reason we can be sure that it gets simplified that much is because God told us it can be simplified that much.
And the reason why there's the simple thing of believing in Jesus Christ and being washed in his blood is because God did the impossible thing of sending his son and dying, because that gulf without that was insurmountable. I mean, you couldn't just believe on God and cross that bridge, because Adam believed there was a God, and Adam still had the problem. You know what I mean? This was not just something that man could do. There's a reason why it became even possible. And I think there's this part of it where when you come to the world is man goes, I'm sufficient. Well, that's just not true.
And right, when I look at the simplicity of the gospel, the point is that God simplified it for really stupid people. As opposed to environmentalism is we can look at the complex idea and we can understand it, and it is that simple. And the reality is God simplified it for man, otherwise we can never come to him. We've kind of been touching on this subject, but one of the fundamental differences, environmentalism believes that the end of everything, the goodness of everything, is to get the world to a certain state, which means that the most valuable thing in the world is the world. Versus Christianity says God is the center of all things. All things are for him and by him and through him. And so the environment, the world, is a tool that we're supposed to use for the glory of God. And so that gives a fundamental shift, which makes some of the behavior the same, but the way you're looking at it is completely different. Is the end the world, or is the end God?
In the Christian worldview, the world is the theater in which God's glorified. And in the environmental worldview, the world is God. It's the thing to be glorified.
I mean, there's the other part I would say as well is In the Christian point of view, the world was created by God, and it was created to fulfill its purposes. It was created to fulfill its purposes like over a period of time. And God knew both what would happen on the earth and what would need to be done and how long the earth would need to be to fulfill its purposes. In the environmental view, the world just happened. We happened to be on it. And there's really we're just going, what do we, we could use up all the earth's resources. We could do this. In the end, they don't really believe that. They don't actually believe that's where everything came from, because they do all these other things that are in denial of it. But in the end, there's this fundamental difference in it. It's like whenever I take my children on a road trip across the United States, my kids don't have to ration their food. When we stop somewhere, they don't have to only eat half the burger because we don't know if we're going to stop again, and we don't know if there's going to be other food. Dad's planned the trip.
My children had to do that. I just keep thinking that Joshua, whenever we went on a road trip, was always afraid to run out of gas. So he was in the backseat making contingency plans. Anyway, that's another story. We cannot go there.
But did you run out of gas a lot?
Yes. Twice in 20 years. Twice.
Well, I don't know. Ben said the only time he's run out of gas is when he was with you.
When did he run out of gas with me? Ben?
Coming back from the summit.
Ben Lepori?
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that time. Okay, so it's been more than two.
I never ran out of gas with you, I don't think. We came really close a couple times.
We weren't close.
Did you have to push the car into the gas station?
No, that was somebody else.
So we have to.
That was on the way to pick up Charles. He wasn't in the car yet.
Really?
Yeah.
My children don't worry about us running out of gas on trips. There's this part of it where there is a fundamentally different view, and somebody who's an evolutionist would look at Christians and go, "You guys are just naive and you're trusting in someone that doesn't exist." But the reality is there is a fundamentally different view that the world was made for a purpose, that the world was made for man, that the world was made for man to do these things, to take dominion and to glorify God, and for man to use these resources. And so when someone comes and says, "You're going to destroy the earth by using the things that God's made for you," you kind of look at them and go, "What are you talking about? You'd be no different than your kids. You're going to destroy your dad's backyard by going in the backyard and digging like he said you could." It's not something that they have to worry about. And so I think there is a fundamentally different view of the world and of the fear that you would have and of the nature of questions you would ask.
And when you think about what does the Bible say about how we're supposed to use the earth and treat the earth, probably the most important passage relevant to that is Genesis 1. And we already read one verse from that, how God made the earth very good. And a few verses before, God had given the dominion mandate, which in Genesis 1, 26 through 27. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So that gives the core thing that we have dominion over the animals, that God has given them to us.
And so what happens then is, in the environmental worldview, what it says is that whenever you use something on the earth, you're basically taking something from the earth. And the Christian worldview is we're supposed to constrain the earth because the earth needs to be constrained. And so the environmentalists are saying man needs to be constrained because he's stealing things from the earth. And God goes, no, the earth was given for man to use to do the things that he's been commanded to do. Like you said, to dig the hole in the backyard, so to speak.
Right.
Go ahead. And like you were saying here, God says he gives dominion to man over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth. And there's this part of it where, from the environmental view, man is just another one of these animals. And part of the reason why they're like you said, the industrial age is one point, but in the end, what they're really saying is one animal shouldn't take preeminence over all the other animals. There's this view of all of a sudden this one particular animal that's no different than any other animal, all of a sudden is making everything else work for it. And they're like, that's an imbalance. There's something off here. And so, it's this really, God says this is what I created it for, and they're saying, even though it really doesn't make any moral sense, they're approaching some sort of balance, because in the end their desire is to be not something made by the Creator for a purpose, but something that's just like all the rest of creation in their view of creation and what it is.
We're told that man is created in God's image, and that sets us apart. That also answers the question, well, should I save the cow or should I save the human? Well, you should save the human, because that is who God put his image upon, and that's who God gave the rest of the animals to be under our control. All the animals, not the rest of the animals. And it raises questions as well when you start to look to how practical things from environmentalism may or may not overlap with Christianity, which is what is dominion. Is dominion different than stewardship? And I think dominion, that word there is about ruling, about control. It's not about conservation. It's not saying that here's the animals and you need to protect them all and keep them intact, but you have rulership over them. Now, you combine that with a lot of other verses in Scripture talking about how animals give glory to God. And, you realize that, wiping off any species that at this moment you don't find useful is not a wise idea. But that's not necessarily core to dominion.
And I mean, it's very different between saying, okay, we want a lion. Jesus is the Lion of Judah. That you want to keep a lion around so that you can understand what that means, and saying that you should have lions roaming around your community so that they can eat children, right? I mean, if you're taking dominion, you put them in a zoo and you go, I can still see the lion and I can recognize its roar, but you've taken dominion of the lion rather than saying, no, the lion needs to be in its natural habitat. Well, no, its natural habitat is a very dangerous. It's very dangerous to humans to have lions in their natural habitat.
And another principle here too is we're in Genesis 1 and Genesis 3 you get sin, and that changes everything. That God created the animals. It seems most likely that he created them with the ability then to, once sin comes into the world, they switch. Lions before, if you have no death, lions aren't eating other animals, and now they do. So the idea that nature, if we show up in a uninhabited island, that is somehow perfect, like God created it. Well, it's not, because animals are eating each other. And now we can't change the animals back to only eat grass with a flip of a button. But the idea that we're going to constrain animals is because there's sin in the world, and so some animals need to be constrained. Now, should you kill every one? I mean, not necessarily. There you can, but to constrain them into limits that we set as the people with dominion over the world makes sense.
I mean, when you talk about lions and keeping lions around and things like that versus letting them roam, we had a previous episode and we talked about how environmentalism was a religion, and we talked about how that one of the ways that it presents itself is through idolatry, and idolatry is they present this alternative view, this false view, and the idea of that lions can coexist peacefully with humans and that they should be allowed to. There's a writer by the name of Peter Hathaway Capstick. He was a guy who was raised in New York, and he ended up going to Africa and spending pretty much the rest of his life in Africa. He was a game warden. He was a big game hunter. He worked on several conservatorships for different types of animals, and he writes a series of books about Africa. And he talks about the Disneyfication of the view of people and animals. And he talks about how that he's seen people actually get killed by animals because they walk into them and act like animals, like this lion won't eat you.
Sing with them, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a guy who goes out with video camera and sets it up, and they can't find him. They find his video camera, and they ship it back to his family. And what they shipped back was this man getting eaten by lions, because he goes, sets up his camera, walks over, and slaps one of the lions on the rump to try to get him to move, and then the lions eat them. I mean, kill the guy. And he goes, this ridiculous sort of idea. He says, and there are many places in Africa where people would, their view of going down to get water was, it's very common for children to be killed by crocodiles, that leopards were going to kill people, that there was just this fatalistic view of there's nothing you can really do about it. And he said they would come in, and when you actually had society, they would drive the wild animals out, and that would change things, and it would change death. But he said there's this view of animals that's just completely false, and man taking dominion over them, it is a good thing. We live in a world without apex predators walking around in our neighborhoods, and that is a good thing.
There's this really amazing passage that's that is helpful to talk about that concept in the Bible, where God is explaining the promises that he has for the children of Israel when he takes them out of Egypt. They do their wilderness wandering. They get to the border of the promised land, this land flowing with milk and honey, where all the good stuff is. God says, I'm going to give it to you, and there's going to be all these people in it, and they're terribly, terribly wicked. And he enumerates all the terribly wicked things that they do, and they're terribly wicked. And God says, but I'm not going to drive them out from you all at once. I'm going to do it little by little, basically, as your population increases enough. I'm going to drive out these terribly wicked people, because if they were all driven out right now, the wild beasts would become too numerous for you. And this is really interesting, where God's contrasting, like, here's this land, it's going to be for you. It's going to be the best land. This is, it's a picture of heaven, scripturally speaking. And it would be better if it were populated by wicked human beings than left barren and populated by wild animals. That's a better state of things, to have these horrible people that I've marked for destruction living there than a whole bunch of animals.
There's a practical level too when it on conservation of these big animals. There's a practical level where unless you say that animals are given for the benefit of man, it's impossible to conserve them, because as these places in Africa get more people living there, as they get more guns, say they're going to kill these animals.
Right.
To have the elephant come through and destroy your crops is not going to make that elephant very popular in that village, and they're going to try to kill the elephant because the elephant does them no good. But if you have people from other countries who are willing to pay a bunch of money to go have the chance to, kill an elderly elephant or, cull the herd, suddenly those elephants have a huge amount of value. And that's how, a lot of these big game are preserved, is because there's people who are willing to pay money to use the elephant to, maybe eat the elephant. Like God said, the animals are given for food. They're willing to do that and pay a bunch of money to do that. And now the elephant has value, and now there's money to maybe put up a fence around a huge area for all the elephants and lions and all this stuff to live in. And now there's a value. Now people are going to be, instead of having all their crops chased by elephants, they're going to spend a summer putting up a fence, and then the elephant isn't going to get in their crops anymore.
And because we've had this view that animals should be in their original state rather than taking dominion, there's been a big shift. I think it was Winnie the Pooh, wasn't it? That he's actually was a bear, and the child would go into the cage with the bear. I think he was in the London Zoo.
Okay.
And you have pictures of him standing there with the bear standing next to him. And they had a view that you were supposed to take dominion, and they said, you can train a bear. You can train all these animals, that if your view is to take dominion rather than that they're pristine and unchangeable, that makes a very different view of what you do with them. And, you look at some of these things that people used to do where they went, well, of course you can train a bear. You can train a bear so that you can let your 10, 11-year-old boy go in with him and not worry about him. And we just don't have that view anymore, because environmentalism now is this creature needs to be in its natural habitat, and it needs to be in the situation where it wants to kill things.
I think there is a part of this too when we talk about taking dominion, that when you look at the passages in Scripture where God's talking about the complexity of nature, it is important to approach it with some caution and some humility, to say we don't understand how all this works. And so just because we have a great idea of here's how we're going to take dominion over nature, we're not held back from doing that by some moral principle that says we can't change nature. But we do need to have caution to say God did make the world to operate in certain ways, and be careful about what we're doing, and look at the consequences. A few years later, are things working out as we hoped? Have people who study biology, who study soil and all these things to understand, are we doing things that are that are working and using the animals and using the plants in the way that God created them, or are we ending up accidentally having consequences that we didn't plan for?
But like we said at the beginning, it really matters that you start off with the right worldview, because if you start off with the wrong worldview, you can have someone, you could have two people who are properly called scientists, who even use scientific principles and scientific methods, but if they start with the wrong worldview, they will come to very different conclusions than you would come to if you start off with the one that God has designed the world for.
Right. If you have a rabid environmentalist, look at your farm, they'll say, well, your farm is bad because it's not an untouched wilderness that hunter-gatherers are foraging from.
Right.
But while that is wacko, you can also have a scientist say, well, actually here you're depleting the soil. Soon your farm is not going to be producing very much. Here's plants that God created to add the nutrients back into the soil. Get on crop rotation, do these things, and you can be set up to take dominion over this for the long term. And instead of, destroying the nature you have, or not destroying, but depleting it, you can do something that's sustainable for the long term.
And those scientists were called farmers for the longest time. You know what I mean? There's a part of it where there's this idea that somehow farmers were just out there, just scratching the dirt with, and not having any idea of how to rotate crops. Whereas some of these things, they've been around for a really long time. And the people who did that, like exactly what you're talking about, were the people who had a vested interest in making their farm more efficient.
Right. But there's also a long history of people messing this up, right? Because there's not always an immediate financial return from doing these things. Because if you're growing cotton and cotton is doing really well,
yep.
Or you're growing tobacco and tobacco is doing really well, and you're depleting the soil, and right next door you could just take over another field and clear it and plant new tobacco for another however many years. There's not that immediate financial gain from doing it. And so you do have, if you're going pure pure practicality, you do lose some things. Where if you have,
I wouldn't call it practicality. I think is the danger.
I think that one thing with that though is what you get out of that is development of fertilizer, and so we have to not just go, well, you deplete the soil. Well, we figured out ways to
re-enrich the soil.
Re-enrich the soil, and so in all those things you have to be really careful, because the answer might be, it's really how are you using the resource, and are you being a good steward of the resource? And a lot of people are not. So I'm completely agreeing with you there. But part of it is sometimes if the market's good, that is the time to deplete it, because that builds up your resources to be able to do something else. And then maybe you don't grow tobacco for 10 years and the soil will recover. And so it does get to be a very difficult problem, but it's really a problem of stewardship instead of looking at it and saying consuming, because the environmentalists want to just say we're consuming things off the earth. And what we're supposed to be saying is, are we being a good steward of the things God gave us?
Right. But you also have principles where if you're just out for yourself, maybe in my lifetime I can make my millions and retire. But then, my children, am I setting it up to be able to pass this on to my children? One of the problems with like a complete libertarian thing with no moral standards is you do cause problems. And having the moral principles that God created the earth and he created it good, and just because it helps us to wreak havoc upon it doesn't mean that we should do that, because he did create it. And taking dominion, there's a right way to take dominion and there's a wrong way too. Like if I give my child something and say, you have jurisdiction over this, you have dominion over it. And then they decide that the way they want to take dominion is just smash it all up and destroy it. Because, right now, I can make an art project. This is going to be modern art. Look, there we go. Modern art. I can sell this for $1 million. Well, they're not taking dominion in the proper way. Not that they can't change it, not that they can't, change it in ways that some people might be uncomfortable with. But there is something that God says, this has value, this is good. And if we get to a point where we are actually destroying things, that's a problem.
And it just seems to me that a lot of times what you hit before you get to that level is you've almost always affected your neighbor. And that's another big thing. Right? Somebody who's depleting his crops that way, he's also going to have other effects. He's going to have erosion effects. He's going to have water, that's taking his soil down. He's affecting people downstream. God has made the world in such a way that it's really hard to come up with a scenario where the person is really abusing the resources that God gave without having an impact on other people. And so if you take all the principles, because it's not just the principle of dominion, it's not just the principle of stewardship, there's also the principle of loving your neighbor and caring for your neighbor. And so a lot of these things, that puts this check on it that says you can't go further than this.
You talk about a situation like that, and you can say that person is worshiping the idol of money.
Mm-hmm.
And the solution for addressing one particular idolatry is not to revert to a different idolatry where instead of worshiping money, now let's worship the earth. And so instead of acting in those kinds of ways, we'll act in different kinds of ways. I mean, you're hitting on, here's the Christian solution. When Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? He says to love God. And then the second one is like it, to love your neighbor. And, any kind of Christian answer to environmental problems has to start with, okay, this is what Jesus said the first two things are. And so if I'm addressing this environmental problem, how am I honoring God with that? And how am I loving my neighbor with a particular kind of solution? Because that covers everything. That covers all the law and the prophets. So any kind of environmental problem ultimately has got to come back to, there's got to be a way to love God and a way to love my neighbor in solving this.
And this is love of God, to obey his commandments. So when we think of the dominion mandate, that is a primary way that we're to love God, right? We're supposed to take dominion of the earth. So these are almost the two things that, if we understand it properly, these are the two things that we merge together. Is how to take dominion, how to use the earth in a way that we're making it more useful, and at the same time that we're doing it in such a way that it's a blessing to our neighbor rather than a curse to our neighbor. And so when we think of the dominion mandate, it's not about don't use the earth. It's use the earth in the way that God made it to be used. Use the earth in a way that does, and it is, God is not a God that's trying to torture people. It is a way of being a blessing to people. If you can grow more food on it, that's a blessing to grow more food on it. This is how the population has gone up, an enormous amount in my lifetime. We have more food now than we did 60 years ago. It's because people are saying, I need to take dominion. I need to use these things. And from that, I be a blessing to my neighbor. And so it's really easy when we look at these to look at them at odds with one another. But Jesus Christ is saying loving God and loving your neighbor are intertwined, that they're not separate.
Right. And the other part is it's who you're, in the different two worldviews, is who you're sinning against. In the Christian worldview, you're either sinning against God or you're sinning against your neighbor. You're not sinning against the earth.
Right.
And part of it, when Joshua was talking, there was a part of it. The reason I had any dissonance at all with what he was saying wasn't the words he was saying. It was more the way those things get used today. Is they say, I see someone using land in a way that I wouldn't use it, and they're sinning against the earth. So then I need to go over to them and stop them from. They're just growing tobacco, so I have to go and stop them from just growing tobacco. And the answer is no. A person can own land, and a person, like you said, they could choose to deplete the land and then to revitalize the land. That's a choice they can make, and they could sin against God. Like you said, and if they're not sinning against their neighbor and they're only sinning against God, then the person who judges them is God. And you know what I mean? And those are very different worldviews, as opposed to we have to regulate the way everyone uses the earth because now we're spokesmen for the earth, as opposed to no, that's not. It's a totally different focus, and it's a totally different view.
Yeah, and, we're talking about, God's law. And as we mentioned, that one of the fundamental principles to God's law is love God, love your neighbor. Right. And there's a law in the Old Testament that directly touches on this topic. Deuteronomy 22:6. If a bird's nest happens to be before you along the way in any tree or on the ground with young ones or eggs, with the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. And you have the idea there that, if you're just completely... If you're taking the mother and the young, then you are, the interpretation would be that you are harming your neighbor because you are not allowing that bird to continue, the bird species to continue to grow.
And that's what I mean. Is I think in the end, when God gives laws, God says the summary of the law is love the Lord your God and love your neighbor, and you can always tie them to those things. And there isn't some other party that has to be protected. There isn't right. Some other interest that you have to take into account. And I think that there's a really big difference there with the environmental movement, because they would argue that they are custodians for the earth. They are speaking for the earth. There's that book by Dr. Seuss, The Lorax. I'm the Lorax and I speak for the trees. No, the Lorax doesn't speak for the trees. There's no one whose job it is to speak for all the trees. I have responsibility for some trees. You have some responsibility for some trees. And there's, and we have to think about that and talk to each other about those things. And there are some things where you could affect other people by how you do these things with the trees, but it's very different than the trees having a spokesman.
And when you look at it, right, I mean, when you look at taking dominion, even the way governments of the world work is that there's different dominions in different places. And it's not a unified that we all take dominion the same way, because that's part of how you figure out what is the right way of taking dominion, right? Because you look at this governmental system and say, well, that works and this one doesn't work. And it comes down to the same thing when you get down to a farm. It comes down to the same thing when you get down to forest land, is the way one person might say to take dominion, if he's actually doing it in a godly way, it will produce fruit. It will be beneficial. Right. In the other way, maybe it will be a generation before his children can't survive on the land anymore. But God set it up so that there are separate dominions. There's not a unified dominion, because this is how we figure out how to take dominion, is because one person's better than the other, and then the people start to imitate him.
And we have historical examples that we can look back on where people were taking dominion, whether or not they probably would have said it as that. And, maybe things didn't go as they intended. You have things like where they go out west and they need furs, and so they, try to kill every sea otter they can find. And they don't quite drive them to extinction, but now they can no longer go out and get sea otters, because they weren't doing it in a way to say, well, let's, how can we make this so that we can continue to have these animals for the future? And I think you can probably find some examples of species that perhaps that have been completely eliminated because of hunting and things like that. But there's a way to do it where you can say, let's have this where we can perpetuate it. And I think one of the big things that people are talking about now is like ocean fishing, where they're overfishing, and that. I don't know the details of that, and if you're looking for hard answers, this is the wrong podcast to be listening to. But the fact that people could be not loving their neighbor by just taking as many fish as they can without any concern for next year they're going to be fished. I mean that could be a real way to not love your neighbor. And
I mean, but tied to that too is then other people came along and started to raise tilapia and other things that were farm raised. They started to raise chinchilla instead of going out and capturing them. So, it's interesting just the complexity of things, that there are things that counterbalance in those cases. And prices do have a real effect. I mean, it's pretty interesting, right? All of a sudden, if there is a shortage of sea otters, so somebody starts to raise sea otters because their pelts are worth so much, guess what? All of a sudden, your sea otters, they're going to be perpetuated because it's worth it for somebody to do it. And so, just the complexities, as you said, I mean, the complexities are just so high because there's different ways to take dominion that can balance against each other.
Right. And, having using the free market and supply and demand is, a way that a lot of these things are solved. People talk about, energy. We need a solution for oil energy. What happens when fossil fuels run out? Well, it's going to happen naturally, just like it happened with wood, like it happened with coal. I mean, as things start to deplete, suddenly the price, it's not like one day there's no more oil. It's that, oil gets more and more expensive as it gets harder to find. And then people say, okay, we need to spend some more time because now we can make a bunch of money if we find out another way to do it. And now people are saying this is going to happen, and people are already doing it. There's government subsidies. There's all kinds of complications. But eventually, the real way that you're going to have a driver or something, because it's depleted, is it gets more profitable to come up with an alternative.
And it seems to me the most obvious example would be fracking, because basically people were saying all these oil fields, they're just not worth getting stuff out of them. And then the price of oil got high enough, and somebody went, wait a second, if we push water in there and use that to force the oil out, we can get enough oil out and make it profitable. And all of a sudden, then you turn around and go, the U.S. now has more oil reserves than any other country in the world. And that's the kind of thing that happens, is because there are resources out there, and then people start to take dominion over other resources. And when we try to fake that and we try to say, well, we can do it some other way, it gets to be, it just doesn't work very well, because it's usually by government fiat, which is very inefficient.
Yeah, you have mining, when there's I'm sure a lot of complexity here, but often when they shut down a mine, it's not because they ran out of whatever they were mining. It just became the price to extract the metal was just below the market value for the metal. And so, metal gets scarce, the value goes up, and now suddenly that mine is a moneymaker.
Right. I mean, it's like, to tie that to recycling, it's like, why do you recycle? Well, does everybody recycle silver and gold? Absolutely. Nobody just goes, let's throw away this gold or throw away this silver. And people were recycling silver and gold from, I remember it back in the 70s that people were doing it because you have the old computers that used to have connectors that were gold. Everybody recycled.
And the gold plating was a lot thicker in the 70s than it is today, right? I mean, it was worth it.
But then you turn around and you look at aluminum cans. Well, do people recycle aluminum cans? Sure, because bauxite requires so much energy to turn it into aluminum because it takes so much to extract out the aluminum from it. And so you just look at these things, and there's all these checks and balances that actually fix these things and give wisdom for what should be done.
Right, which is why most of the recycling that's done is just put in a landfill because it's not economically viable to recycle it. And so it's basically a waste of effort sorting out all this recycling because the stuff that is feasible, metal and things like that, there's markets for that. Other stuff, what are they going to do with it? I've been to the dump where they bring in the recycling from the convenience center where everybody needs to put their cardboard in the dumpster, and then they unload that dumpster right next to all the other garbage, and it goes to the landfill like everything else.
One thing that environmentalism does that is fundamentally different than Christianity is that God created the world to point to him. So the physical things are pointing to spiritual things, while environmentalism says the physical things is the end.
Right.
So when we think of stewardship, we should be thinking of that physical stewardship as a model of spiritual stewardship. Like in 1 Corinthians 4, 1 and 2, it says, "Let a man so consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required in stewards that one be found faithful." And so again, if you're faithful in little things, you'll be faithful in greater things. And part of the signs of that we should be really careful about our stewardship, because if we're not even faithful in material things, which God says, hey, if somebody blesses you in spiritual things, why are you withholding carnal blessings? There's no reason for that. Spiritual things are much more important. We should just recognize if we're not being faithful in physical things, we should really question how faithful we're being as stewards of much more important things, the spiritual things.
I mean, there's a verse where God says something just very pointed. He says, if a person is not faithful in worldly mammon, he will not be faithful in spirit. And if he is faithful in worldly mammon, you can expect him to be faithful in spiritual things. I mean, God's tying them together really, really tightly. And I think, that's kind of what you're talking about here is when we were talking about free market, kind of the free market and capitalism, there's this part of it where environmentalism is a fake market. It's intended to be a fake market. Right. It's created to be a fake market. And so in the end, there's no way to count. You can't look at profit. You can't look at what's profitable. And you look at, there are several parables where that's all God talks about is profitability. And he talks about, a master goes into another, he gives money, he comes back and he says, how much money did you make for me off of what I gave you? And that's the sole determination of whether they're cast into hell. Well, that's very different from environmentalism. Because in the end, the guy who buried it in the backyard, he was a conservationist. You know what I mean? And he didn't want to take any risk with it. He didn't want any chance of anything happening to it. He just kept it as it was. And God said, I expect you to do something with it. I expect you to look at the world and say, what can you do with it? And the truth is doing things is inherently messy. It's inherent. There are a lot of people who have never done anything. And because of that, this is who environmentalism gets sold to, is people who've never actually went in the world and done something that was difficult or done something that required any complexity. Because if you have, you recognize you can't do it in this pristine way. You can't do it in this beautiful way that they want to. You have to mess things up. You have to break them. You have to figure out how to do them. You have to make mistakes. You have to solve problems. And that's inherently different than the view. You don't have that liberty within environmentalism. You have to follow these very strict rules that don't allow you to do those things.
Right. Christianity says we're supposed to make our mark in the world. And I don't mean like for our own fame or anything, but we're supposed to take dominion of it. We're supposed to control it. And environmentalism says, leave nothing behind but footprints. It says make sure that nobody can tell that you were there. And that's just not what what Christians are supposed to be about. And
Christians supposed to throw their water bottle. No,
I'm not advocating littering, by the way.
Footprints and empty water bottles.
We're supposed to go cut down that tree so we could build a house. How's that?
Right.
Right. I mean, it's supposed to be, our goal in the world is not to leave it unchanged.
I think the idea is out there that if you're saying that the world to take dominion of and not to preserve unchanged, that then you're going to have, the entire world be parking lots and McDonald's and shopping malls. That's not the reality. I mean, the world is huge. There's a lot of places that, you can't turn them into, a farm. You can't. There's not, well, at least not with the technology that we have these days. I mean, the climate's not right for it. The soil's not right for it. There's no water there. I mean, as things are set up, you're going to have wilderness areas. And the idea that men should not impact it, that environmentalism says that basically the ideal is to have large areas that are just empty and that, people really shouldn't even go visit them. I mean, yeah, how can we have a park and not let people visit it? But really, we want to even minimize how many people are visiting it. That's not really a great idea. And I say this as, I like hiking, and I like hiking where there's nobody else there. And a lot of the mountains on the East Coast, the best mountains, they put roads to the top and visitor center, which is totally lame. I mean, I'm supposed to hike 10 miles to the top of the mountain and then find a parking lot, really? But that idea that I have does not really match what Scripture says. Is a mountain serving it's more glorifying to God if it's a mountain that's really hard to get to so that only 10 people a year get to it and never see that mountain? Or is it more glorifying to God if there's a nice visitor center up there where 10,000 people a year can drive up and see the view and glorify the God that made the view?
Or a live stream.
Right.
You can look at the mountain from home.
So 10 people go do it and there's a live stream. But I think it's unquestionably, it should be set up for people to go out and visit these things, because that's the point of having it. It's not for it to be there and, only elite hikers be able to go see it, of which I am not one. But, but that's not the point of why nature's there.
And one of the humorous things about environmentalism is they go, we need to have those wilderness areas to set aside to our children so that we can't go there. Well, then why should our children be allowed to go there? But that was the argument that they used to make, that we had to have these big wilderness areas and nobody was allowed to go in them so that they'd be reserved for our children, who I would assume in 30 years they'll be saying, no, you can't go there.
It's actually a pretty interesting problem right now. My wife was reading something about how people who are educating, and you've heard there's been a lot of push about let's get out in the woods right now. And the reason that you're hearing all of that is because there's educators who realize the messaging has been so heavy on don't mess anything up, don't touch anything, that children are actually afraid of going into nature and messing it up because that's what they've been told.
Right.
And if that's what you tell people, they're not going to go out there, and then they're not actually going to value it for whatever reasons you want them to value it for, other than the fear of, I could mess it up.
And they've puffed up the power of people so much that child thinks he could actually mess it up, that there's no resiliency to it. There's no ability of nature to...
Nature's
there's
fragile.
no God.
It's
Nature's
so fragile.
so fragile,
fragile balance.
that you have a 5-year-old walk through the woods and all of a sudden all the trees are going to die. I mean, it's just ridiculous, but yet that's what the messages that are being taught.
Right. It's very superstitious. I mean, it's very being fearful of nature, even if it's fearful of nature for nature's sake. It's just it's a very superstitious view of the world.
And the Bible even talks about a similar concept to this, that we need to be taking this land that has been quote unquote civilized and reverting it back to nature. And that's actually a curse, Isaiah 13:21-22. But wild beasts of the desert will lie there, and their houses will be full of owls. Ostriches will dwell there, and wild goats will caper there. The hyenas will howl in their citadels, and jackals in their pleasant palaces. Her time is near to come, and her days will not be prolonged. So the ideal in Scripture isn't this great biological diversity in an area that used to be taken over by humans. That's bad. That means these people were judged, and these animals that had been constrained, kept out of this area, are now coming back in.
And part of the problem is that people recognize that the world needs to be redeemed, right? They're looking at it and they're saying there's problems that need to be fixed. And if you say that, then all you can do is the things that you can do, so to speak. Meaning, all you can do is say, well, we'll let the animals back in because then maybe that will fix the problem. As opposed to God gives a higher view that you look at that says, no, this is the work that God's going to do, that man can't do this. This is far beyond what man can do. Like in Romans 8:19 through 22. For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subject to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. So one of the things is people do see that there are problems in the earth, but they're looking to themselves as a solution to those problems. Maybe if we let the wild animals, maybe if we made it like it was before, instead of recognizing that the earth can't heal itself. The earth can't solve the reason that it's groaning. The earth can't solve the fact that it's wearing out like a garment. These are things beyond its ability to solve, and beyond man's ability to solve it too, because on one hand, man's this tiny thing, and on the other hand, he's the one that's changing the world. And it will all fail because it requires God to redeem the world.
And there's a part of it where it was subjected to futility. Some of that futility was, there's a part of that was death. That was,
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this part of it where when you do watch that David Attenborough special and it talks about the beauty of the cycle of nature and all this stuff, there's a part of it it's glorying in the futility. And because they can't see an end to that futility. There's no hope. Where it talks about they were subjected to this not willingly, but because of him who subjected them to it in hope, that's very different than the view that they have. And when Joshua was even talking about, will there ever be a time where the lion lays down with the lamb again? And the Bible does talk about that. There is this day coming where the lion and the lamb will be able to lay down, where there will be no more death. And that's something that's completely beyond the hope of the environmentalists. That's something that exceeds their even ability to conceive of.
And one of the things is if you don't have a view that you should advance things, then the best you can ever get is that you try to reach a point of it being static, which means it's futile, that it's just going to keep cycling through forever. It's going to stay the same forever. And so that's what environmentalism ends up doing, which is very fundamentally different than what Christianity is supposed to do, although in a lot of ways Christianity has adopted the view of environmentalists, right? We're all going to die. Everything's going terrible. Everything's going to get worse. But true Christianity says we're supposed to be taking dominion. We're supposed to be the stone that was cut without hands that will fill the whole earth, become a mountain that fills the whole earth. The whole earth is supposed to be changing. And environmentalism says you just want to get it back to where it was so it can stay where it is and just continue in futility forever. And Christianity says it's not supposed to be that way. We're supposed to take dominion, and that means to advance it.
That goal to get it back to this cycle of staying in the past, of staying in its status quo. The other side of that is the big fear of environmentalism is, climate change, global warming, and ultimately final destruction of the earth so that it's uninhabitable in a shorter amount of time than they say it inevitably will be. I think that's a big contrast between a biblical view of the earth and an environmentalist view of the earth. That there is some sort of existential threat that things are going to end if we mess this up. Because that is really core to current environmentalism.
Which means that current environmentalism is really based on pride. Because we're saying man is God, and so man can actually destroy the world. That's what environmentalism is based on. It's been different at different times, but that's certainly the current view, is that man is God, and so he can destroy the world because he's a foolish God that doesn't understand anything. He's a God in power without any wisdom. And so because of that, you always have to worry about what this fool's going to do. He's a fool that has this power that has no idea of the power that he has, and the environmentalists think that they're supposed to teach people of the power that he has, and to the point that they get that they're like a child walking in the forest going, all these trees are going to die because I walked through here. And so just the arrogancy of believing that we have that kind of power when God says what's going to happen, when God says this is what I'm going to do.
So, you turn on the news these days after any natural disaster, whether it's a flood or whether it's a hurricane or a wildfire, and you hear about how really, this was because of climate change. But if you look in the scriptures, there's a lot different reaction to or interpretation of natural disasters. It's all over the Bible, but for example, in Deuteronomy 28, verses 21 through 24, the Lord will make the plague cling to you until he has consumed you from the land which you are going to possess. The Lord will strike you with consumption, with fever, with inflammation, with severe burning fever, with the sword, with scorching, and with mildew. They shall pursue you until you perish. And your heavens which are over your head shall be bronze, and the earth which is under you shall be iron. The Lord will change the rain of your land to powder and dust. From the heaven it shall come down on you until you are destroyed. And so those are the promises, the curses that God was saying were going to come upon the children of Israel if they did not follow the law that he had given them. And those are things that every one of those would probably be assigned to global warming if they happen in the U.S. But that's not what God says.
And I mean, I just remember during Hurricane Katrina, where some people said people should be asking if this is the judgment of God, and they got destroyed in the media.
And destroyed by Christians.
Exactly.
God
That's what I
would
was
never
say.
do this.
That destroyed by Christians who say God would never do this, but then those same so-called Christians will turn around and say it's because of global warming. And we just need to recognize that we have substituted including in the church. And I don't even think as a percentage, it's probably that much less in the visible church, those who profess to be Christians, versus the society where we accept the idea that judgment comes because of how we have sinned against the earth, not about how people have sinned against God.
You can pause the podcast for just a moment, get out your concordance, and go look up the word pollution and see, because it actually shows up in the Bible. And do you want to know what God says causes the land to be polluted? Because he actually says, here's what causes the land to be polluted. And it's not overuse of fossil fuels. It's not nuclear waste. It's not any of the things, And don't be surprised if you get directed to Leviticus. It says, well, here's what causes the land to be polluted. This is what causes people to be vomited out of the land, is a whole variety of very specific sins. Of idolatrous worship, of murder of children, of a suite of sexual sins. And God says, because of these things that the Canaanites are doing, that the land is polluted and that it will vomit them out. And if you start with that, if all you had to define what pollution was the Bible, you would come up with a very different definition of pollution. You would come up with a very different definition of conflict between man and the land. Because conflict between man and the land is ultimately breaking God's law. And that's why, and that's the sort of thing that God's going to say, this land is not going to be habitable for you anymore. It's going, the earth is going to turn to bronze and the sky to turn to iron because of your sins against me, not your sins against the land.
And the point here isn't that, pollution traditionally defined or modern definition of pollution doesn't matter, and you can dump whatever you want in the air, you can dump whatever you want in the water. But the point is that, now that is the main thing that we're concerned about.
The point that I'm trying to make really is that what we've done is God has said, here's the things that I really care about, and we've decided we're going to care about a very different set of things because we think we can do stuff about that. We think that we can appease the problems, that we can buy ourselves redemption there, that we can, but get some carbon credits.
Right. And I would just argue that on a lot of this stuff, though, what we're doing is reassigning things, right? But when I was growing up, there was a creek behind my house, and the people upstream dumped raw sewage into it. And I mean, that would get foam on it and stuff from the phosphorus and stuff from the laundry detergent. And I mean, it really affected people downstream from that. And that really has an impact. And people go around and they say, well, this is because of the pollution. Well, it is because of the pollution. But fundamentally, the pollution was they didn't care about anybody downstream. Their hearts were hard against everybody downstream. I mean, they didn't care that there were kids playing in this creek, that they were dumping raw sewage in and causing sickness. They just didn't care. And so, it was pollution. And I think we can make that pollution be separate from the spiritual pollution, but the spiritual pollution frequently is what's driving the physical pollution.
But when you're looking at what the real bad disasters, the wildfires, the floods that are, people are dying, Lots of people are dying. You shouldn't be as worried about that from, physical things that we're doing wrong in the environment. God says why these things happen to people, and they're because of sins. They're because of sins that are all through America. So could some nation have horrible, wildfires because they were just bad stewards of their land? Well, maybe, but that's not going to be America, because we're told you do sins like this and bad things happen to you. And we do sins like this in this country, and so we can expect bad things to happen to us.
I would probably argue that's slightly different in the sense that look at California. California does all kinds of evil, perversion, right? A lot of the fires are pretty close to San Francisco. I mean, it's a very perverse state. But the perversion of that state becomes everybody should be able to do whatever they want, which means that we can't clear out any trees because trees should be allowed to pile up in the forest. And I don't think you can separate the two, because the reason that they are getting wildfires getting to be as big as they were 200 years ago when there was absolutely no dominion is because they're saying under no circumstances you should take dominion. Everybody should be able to do what's right in their own eyes, including a tree. And so you can't separate these things and consider them in two separate categories. The reason that these wildfires get bigger and bigger is because refusing to take dominion, and they refuse to take dominion because they love their sin. I mean, one thing that is important to remember is as we look at what environmentalism is trying to do, which is to try to bring the world back to a pristine condition, whatever that definition is. Christians are supposed to remember that's not what the world's headed towards. 2 Peter 3, 5-7 says, "For this they willfully forget, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men." God has said what's going to happen to the world. So we act like we can make this pristine, and it's not going to work. God has decreed what's going to happen.
And also in that passage, you have the promise that we're not going to render the world uninhabitable through our own actions. That's not how it's going to play out. I mean, God already judged the world once with water, with all but destroying life on Earth. And we do. Not that. I mean, you have to deal with the details, but global warming is not going to destroy mankind. It's not. The fate is planned out, and it doesn't involve us extincting ourselves.
And specifically, it says that God's not going to bring this judgment upon the world until the last person who is elect by God is saved. And that's what's going to bring this judgment, is once the last person is saved, then the judgment can come.
But all of that really relies on you actually have to believe God.
Right.
And you have to believe that he has a plan for history, that he's working out and will bring to these specific conclusions. And an environmentalist who starts with an evolutionary premise just doesn't have that. And all they have is chaos working itself out.
But I think there's a lot of Christians that even though they have this in theory, they don't connect it to the reality of that should drive what your environmental policy is.
And what I'm saying to them is you have to believe God. You have to believe God when he says, here's what I'm doing now, here's what I'm going to do in the future. I am remaking things. There's going to be a new heavens and a new earth. My people are going to be safely populated in the New Jerusalem. It's pretty big.
And it says that there's plenty of food in the furrow of the wicked. Excuse me. There's plenty of food in the furrow of the poor. And the issue is that we look at the world and go, oh, if we do the right thing, we're going to destroy the world. And God goes, no, I've built the world to be a blessing. The problem with the world being a cursing is man and how we treat it and how we deal with it. So if we, by faith and truly are seeking to do what God commands us to do, that is how to treat the world the best. That's how to make it the most productive. That's how to make it the most sustainable. That's how to make it all the things that it should be, because just like God will curse the disobedience by causing the land to rebel against you and to vomit you out, obedience will cause the land to be a blessing and to be bountiful.
You mentioned that all the environmentalists has this kind of chaos and randomness, but in the end, they actually don't live their life that way. They end up coming back to they have faith in something. they still do put faith in things, because the truth is even though they think that chaos and randomness brought them here, they still actually live in an ordered life. It's just ordered by faith in the wrong things. It's ordered by faith in their idols. It's ordered by faith in themselves, or in, like I said, in the earth, or in some things that they definitely know better than, because God says He's revealed Himself to us. But that's really, it's just their faith is real.
They still use terms like good and bad and better and should and shouldn't. All these are moral terms that only make sense if you live in a moral universe. If you live in an evolutionary universe, there's nothing but nature red in tooth and claw. It's just bloody all the way down. And either you come to grips with that, or you have to say, you know what, something here has to make sense because there's a creator.
And related to that is the idea that if everything is chaos, then why do you think you can predict? Why do you think you can predict that in 40 years it will be a degree and a half hotter? Why do you think you can predict that the oceans will go up and all these other things that they keep making predictions?
Or why does it matter?
Or why does it matter? But even so, they're ordering their life, saying that what the most important thing is to stop this doom that's coming, that we know will come because the world's orderly, even though they've argued that it's disorderly. You use this word doom like it's a bad thing. It's just chaos. Nothing is meaningful.
Except every single person who lives in the end knows that's not true. Right? They all understand that if somebody cut off their leg tomorrow, they'd be unhappy about it.
Right. They claw and hold on to life desperately, because every man has a fear of death. And
so even though philosophically and logically they shouldn't, they all do by reality. And so they all do it, and they're trying to avoid a doom that they want to predict that's coming, even though according to their own worldview, they shouldn't be able to predict it coming.
Because as much of a rebel as they are still a creature of God, and God put eternity in their hearts, and they're trying to solve that problem.
The environmentalists live by faith. In 1970, they were predicting that the world was going to freeze over, and then they predicted that it was going to heat and burn up, and then they they keep predicting these things that, in the IPCC, the Climate Change Council for the UN, keeps publishing reports saying in 5 years everything's going to, we've reached the point of no return. And yet people still read those and believe those, even though if you go back to, I think they just released the 6th one or something like that. If you go back and read the first one, there would be no UN to print it because we would have all been destroyed. Right. And so they have this faith that they require it to be blind, and Christians shouldn't have blind faith.
Right. We've done a number of episodes on the connection between faith and reason, on how we're called to think, how Jesus Christ comes as reason, He comes as logos, He comes as thought, He comes as the word. Christians should be very different than this. And there's a part of it where the fact that we have let people who don't have a basis for their faith mock Christians and act like they aren't reasonable, when in fact it's the other way around. It's to our shame.
And it really, you look at it, and so much of their stuff is so easily mocked. Right? All these people are switching to paper straws and all this other stuff because some turtles choked on straws, and it's terrible that turtles choked on straws. I'm not pro turtle choking on straws, but you
want to kill a turtle with your own hands, right?
But virtually all the straws that get dumped out in the ocean are from China. Right. In the U.S. we put them in landfills. They just don't. Sure, at the beach maybe somebody does, drops one where they had a cup, but the reality is that pollution, changing plastic straws in the U.S. will do absolutely nothing to stop turtles from being killed by straws. But that doesn't change the fact that we have to remake our whole economy to have people have horrible paper straws rather than plastic straws, because a turtle might die, even though we know a turtle won't die. But there's just no rationality, let's see how A follows to B.
There is a rationale, though, to it. And the rationale is I am a person who is racked with all sorts of sins against God, and I've got this guilt that is just eating at me. But instead of repenting and dealing with any of that, I will create another set of problems over here that I can solve by buying paper straws instead of buying plastic straws.
See, I would
That's the
argue that's
rationale.
irrational. I understand there's a rationale,
That's-
but I would
that's
still
the
argue that's
rationale.
irrational.
It's not rational, but that's the rationale.
But understand the lies that you have to tell and believe to get there, because I have in my head the idea that there is a continent-sized body of trash in the ocean. And I know that they said continent, but I mean, I've been told multiple times that there is a very large swirling mass of trash that is produced by the U.S. that is in the ocean. It is us. It is us that's doing it. We're the ones who's doing it. And like you said, when they went and did research, guess what? People in the United States, almost none of their trash they throw in the water. I mean, it does.
It's not a major percentage at all.
Right. I mean, it's so tiny to be statistically negligible.
Right, versus other countries where they don't have landfills and they all just throw their garbage out the back door and it washed into the river and washes into the ocean. Like, you can see pictures where, like, you know, rivers are just covered with garbage, but it's generally not from the United States.
Right. And so, I mean, it's just a very interesting, but I mean, to deal with that guilt, you have to tell actual lies about statistics and, I mean, what they would call science. Right. I mean, in the end, I was told it as a scientific fact that this is the reality of it. And that's a problem. You know, I mean, if you think that because I have this guilt in my heart, I have to deal with this, so I'm going to tell all these lies, that causes some real problems with society.
But
Right?
they're working hard to tell lies to themselves so that they believe it. So why wouldn't they accept other people's lies?
And if you want to actually deal with garbage, you know, what is environmentalism? What moral reason is there? You know, what animal throws its garbage? What animal cares at all about its garbage? You know, there might be some. It'd be interesting to know what animal does. But generally, animals don't care what they leave behind.
Right.
Why do we have to? Well, because we're made in God's image and we're supposed to be doing things orderly. I mean, you can derive these principles from Scripture, where it's a good thing to go, you know, pick up, you know, the litter that people throw out their cars into in your front yard. I mean, that's
Right.
a good thing to do. That's something we should be doing. We should be, you know,
Taking
cleaning
dominion.
things up, taking dominion. And we actually have a rationale when other people don't really have one. And if we've looked at all these different areas of where, you know, environmentalism versus biblical dominion, you know, where there's some similarity, there's differences. You know, there's things that they're really concerned about that are going to change the world that we may not be very concerned about, but maybe a little wisdom needs to be applied there. But you know, when it comes down to it, we have reasons for doing things. We have reasons for learning about creation because there's a God of creation. We have reasons to get excited about it because it has meaning to us, because it's reflecting God. We have reasons to, you know, take care of the things that God has given us because we know that they're for our good. We can benefit from them. We can use them for good things. You know, we can preserve, you know, nature because we can, you know, enjoy it. We can use it for the purposes that God has given us. And that comes down to even, you know, simple things. You know, you're, you know, planting things around your house, keeping your yard clean. I mean, things that, you know, we don't need to stop using plastic straws, but there are things that we can do to appreciate the world that God has given us.
One thing that happens when you don't have a standard is that you swing too far. So I can remember when I was young that there was a lot of pollution. There was a lot of where streams were polluted. And now we've swung too far the other way. And the only one that can do that check to say that there is the road that we should walk on. It's a narrow way that people can go to the right or to the left. And that's what happens is you get this swinging back and forth from we're all going to die because it's going to be a new ice age to we're all going to die because it's going to get so hot. And the environmental movement has to swing back and forth because it has no standard to stop itself, to say, no, this is going towards the goal that I should be going to, because they don't even know what the goal is. And without something that's beyond them, they're never going to be able to stop. They're always going to swing because they have no reason to say, this is where I should stop. Christians are supposed to say, this is where I should stop. As we talk about this issue, it's really easy to not be thinking about the details and just go, oh yeah, I'm for the environment. And then you end up propping up a system that's against God. Or you can say, I'm against environmentalism. So then you end up fighting against God because you don't do the things that are good to do. Instead, what we're supposed to do is examine things according to the light of Scripture and say, what should we be doing? Because some of what environmentalism is pushing for is good, but a lot of it is to replace God, and that obviously is evil. Thanks for joining us.
This has been The Conquering Truth, a project of Reformation Baptist Church. If you found this helpful, you can visit us online at theconqueringtruth.com and subscribe here or in your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.